Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I don't know where you are or what time you're watching this, but hi, I'm Professor Freeman. This is Fire Tech 104, Fire Prevention at Santa Ana College. And today's lesson is the impact of fire prevention on fire department operations. Why, you ask? Because it's a great place to start. You've already gone through fire protection organization and fire behavior. You're on your way to being a firefighter. But now it's time to learn where fire prevention fits in. So fire prevention is another aspect of the fire service and another career that's available to you as you complete your program here at Santa Ana College. Look for my other video on what can you do with a degree in fire technology. Today, we're going to look at what happens when we get firefighting operations and we mix it with fire prevention. Kind of like getting peanut butter in the chocolate. Turns out it was a good idea. So let's get started. Whenever you start learning something new in the fire service, the best thing for you to do is pay attention to the learning objectives. Everything we do is based upon those objectives, and everything you get tested on is based on those objectives. And I don't know that I'm supposed to tell you that, but I've sat on a lot of committees and I've helped write a lot of curriculum at the national level, and that's what we do. We came up with the goals. We said, everybody needs to know this. Go ahead and write the textbooks for us, and this is what they have to cover. That's why all of our textbooks cover the same stuff. I'm really that old. Okay, so enough about that. Here's what you need to know in this lesson. So as I go through, if you start nodding off, or you're like, do I really need to know this? Or is this going to be on an exam? If it answers these questions, the answer is yes. And if it doesn't answer any of those questions because I've gone off on a tangent, well, probably not. Then you can like fast forward through it. But then you might miss a good story. You never know. Okay, so let's move on because this is like the 8th time I've recorded this. And the first time it was an hour and a half. So, right, I know it. I heard you groan. Even I felt the groan. And you haven't even heard this yet. I don't even know what this take is going to make. But okay, so here's what we're doing. We're identifying the need for fire prevention paradigm shift in the fire service. Now, you're going to sit there and go, wait a minute. What's a paradigm? I'm not in the fire service, so why would I be needing to shift anything? You know, you're going to learn about it. But you're also going to learn what your role is going to be. And the good news is the shift has already started happening. And you are like riding the wave. Seriously, I'm going to tell you, the wave comes to be January 2024. That's why you're in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. So we're going to focus on that. What's the paradigms to them? What's going to shift? Where's my role? Hey, guess what? There's jobs. Identify how fire prevention impacts the fire department. So we'll talk about that. And hopefully you have already watched the video Urban Infernos. We got a lot of infernos this semester. So I've got first one, Urban Inferno, and watch that. And as you're watching it, remember the stuff you've learned in 101 and in 102. And be thinking about, okay, so what is fire prevention's role here? And then we're going to identify the national, state, and local fire challenges. When we're done with all of that, I've got a couple of extra slides, not part of the publishers, but I want to show you how all of this plays out in the real world. And then I have another video for you. I think it's called Taking It to the Streets. And that's where we're going to take everything that you learned in here, how how fire prevention impacts the fire department, the need for a paradigm shift of what your role is in it, and understanding the historical impact that prevention has had and what we're doing to meet these changes. So I'm going to show you this video, and in that video, you're going to pick out all of these concepts. I know, but you're going to like it. It's firefighters, right? And it's fire, and they're talking about stuff. And literally, as we talk about collaboration and advocacy and the influence we have on each other, all of this stuff will come around in that last video that we're going to watch. So that's what we've got on tap. And let's get started, shall we? And see if I can do this in under an hour and 30 minutes. I know. And I'm going to have to keep moving these around, I think, but I'll keep them up there. So first question is, how does the first responder impact fire prevention? Well, there's two ways. One is through leadership, and the other is by embracing fire prevention, which sounds a little bit hokey, right? Oh, that's my arms around that. But we're going to put our arms around that, and it's not going to be as geeky as it sounds. Both of those things are important, and there's different ways of carrying those tasks out. Let's move that. So how does fire prevention shape the battlefield? That's kind of a cool way of referring to the fire ground, don't you think? So if you watched the video Urban Infernos, and if you haven't, when you do, think about all of the things that you need in order to fight those urban infernos. Hydrants, access to gates and doors and barricades or barriers, fire department access for you physically and for the apparatus and support vehicles. Knowing what hazards are inside of the building would be really useful before you go in, right? Having a fire, knowing where the fire alarm control panel is would be incredibly useful. And knowing where fire department connections are at. Those are just some of the basics. And those are all things that are installed into our infrastructure and our buildings for the purpose of helping you, the first responder. I know, they don't just magically appear. And by the way, someone's got to pay for them. So let's talk about the paradigm shift, right? That's what we said the first objective was to understand that we need a paradigm shift. So what is a paradigm? A paradigm refers to our culture being the norms, our attitudes, and our beliefs. Oftentimes when we talk about culture, we can talk about it in terms of ethnicity, right? Our cultural norms, attitudes, and beliefs that are special to the group of people that we belong to, whoever that might be, and whatever family that might be, right? We all have different groups. And within those groups exist certain cultures. And this is true in the workforce. Every fire department has a different culture, yet the fire service shares a culture that's different from the police department or criminal justice. They have a different culture, which is different from academia. So we have these different cultures. Think about the cultures that you interact with and are part of. Where you work, in your home, maybe you're dating somebody who is from a different culture, or who whatchamacallits, is associated with another culture. understand, so norms, attitudes, and beliefs. And this is going to be a running theme throughout this class. Because as we look at culture within the fire service, certainly there needs to be a paradigm change there. But our job is working with a variety, all the different cultures in the communities that we serve. And that means we have to be able to look at them with a different set of eyes. We can interpret our own norms, attitudes, and beliefs because we understand where those come from. But we can't use that screen, if you will, or filter. We can't use that filter to judge other people and their cultures. They should do it to us. Anyway, so should we just recognize norms, attitudes, and beliefs? And that's what we're talking about today, are the norms, attitudes, beliefs in the fire service regarding fire prevention. Which just, let's get it straight, nobody likes it, right? Nobody likes it. Nobody thinks they're going to die in a fire, right? Nobody thinks that's going to happen to them. And nobody likes to be taught. So let's just start off with the idea that in prevention, when we go out, our job is to get code compliance. And our job is to get voluntary code compliance, if possible. And that's what we want to do. And so to do this, right, we have to be able to communicate and talk with other people, because it's easier when they're partners. Because here's the deal. We don't have the authority to be overlords. And there's just too much to do that. It'd be awesome if we were overlords, but we're not. So we're going to try to build partnerships and work with our stakeholders. And our firefighters are part of that. And this paradigm shift in the way we view fire prevention in the fire service. So historically, okay, let's start with that. The old days, prevention was looked at as non-traditional, right? That's not what we do. We put wet stuff on the red stuff. I wasn't hired for that. I'm not a cop. I was hired as a firefighter, right? Prevention is the criminal justice side of the house. We are police officers, but a different kind of police officer. We're the type that judges really don't want to see in their courtrooms. It's true. They don't want to see us. They want us to work things out. If we can't work things out, then we'll go to the courtroom. But that's not the first fix. So the company officer has the greatest opportunity to change the culture towards fire prevention. And you're going to be sitting there going, I'm just a student, Suzanne, get real. But what I know is if you're coming through our program, there's a very good chance you are going to be a company officer. And you're going to take this information with you. Why do I know that? Because in April or May of this year, I got a phone call from a firefighter. He's been a firefighter for about 6 years. He works in a small community, not rural, but in an urban wildland interface area. And it's an area that's designated by the state fire marshal as a very high fire zone. So he called me to say, hey, Suzanne, excuse me one second. Can't do that with PowerPoint. So he says, hey, Suzanne, this is the community I'm in. Here's my situation. I went through a state fire academy. I know there are tools out there to deal with our situation. If I go to the inspector if I go through the inspector series, will I get the information I need to do something about this? And so the problem he was having was with wildland areas. This fire department doesn't have a fire prevention program, and the fire chief doesn't know anything about fire prevention. And what he's afraid of is that they're all going to die. And that's literally what he said. It's not the community he's necessarily worried about. It's the people he's working with. He said that the areas are so bad, they're not going to be able to drive through them, that they're going to be hurt or killed. And he knows that there is something that can be done, but he doesn't know what it is. And that's where fire prevention comes in. And so turns out he came to class, went through the class. About halfway through, he said, fire chief said if he passed all the classes, he would be the fire marshal. And the good news is he did. He passed all of the classes, and I believe he's a fire marshal now, and he's starting to get things done. So it happens. It just takes someone who understands you don't have to reinvent the wheel for anything. We've been doing the same darn thing over and over again for centuries. So, what needs to change? This attitude towards prevention, that it's something different than suppression. So I teach the advanced classes, right? So once you finish these core classes, and once you finish just the basic 5, 101, 102, 104, 5, and 6, you're then qualified to go into the inspector series. Again, look for the video on what you can do with your fire technology degree. Anyway, so, right, in these advanced classes, just like the story I just told you, I get lots of firefighters who come in and it's later in their career. So they've been in the fire service for a long time. And as they start going through the classes, they say, oh my gosh, how come nobody ever taught us this in the fire academy? This would have changed everything. And that's why I'm glad you're here, because you're going to get some of that in this class. And when you understand how fire prevention and fire operations, emergency operations, work together, you'll see that if you pay attention and you do the assignments I ask you to do, you're going to build a resume that is going to be incredibly impressive, that you're going to be able to take forward. Because the paradigm shift that I've been telling you about, that we're talking about now, that look, good fire prevention means good fire department operations. And what we need is a culture that believes that it's not just something we say, it's something that we all believe. And so when we have these fire departments, these communities in these very high fire zones, meaning if there's a wildland fire, they're going to lose the community. And they're not doing anything to mitigate that. How fair is that to the community? So we have tools. And again, the paradigm shift is here. So with fire inspections, you're going to hear the term company inspection. Company inspection. I want you to write that down. Company inspection. A company inspection is when a fire company goes out and does an inspection. So those are firefighters and first responders that are actually doing the inspections. So as I told you, we are not overlords, but every building in our community, with the exception of 1 and 2 family dwellings, residential, 1 and 2 family homes, has to be inspected or should be getting inspected. And the other thing is, we inspect more than just buildings. The building department and the building code inspects structures that are being built, that they're building, right? The building code only applies to buildings that they're currently building. The fire code applies to every structure that is being built, that's existing, and that's being demolished. And the site it's sitting on, and the people that are in it, and the stuff that's there, where the building code regulates structures, we regulate nouns. We do. We regulate nouns, people, places, and things. We regulate people, places, and things, and judges really don't want to see us in their courtrooms. But when an entire community burns down, like in Maui, the community wants to know what was up with the regulations. Why were we not being protected? Why did our firefighters not have the tools they need to be successful? So fire departments don't have enough people to inspect all the buildings. And when we run out of money, we get rid of civilians. So who does inspections? Civilians like me get hired as fire inspectors to do inspections, but firefighters also have to do inspections. And captains have to be trained at a much higher, at this pretty much the same level as an inspector, because they're responsible for overseeing your inspections that you're doing on an engine company as a firefighter. So, but you guys weren't getting any training. So NFPA, who sets out the occupational standards for firefighter in NFPA 1001, and for fire inspector and fire prevention personnel in 1031. So NFPA 1031 is the standard for fire inspectors for our training and what we have to know and be able to do. But that goes away in December of this year. And they have a whole new set. I know. And one of the new areas is first responder inspector. I know. First responder inspector, that's you. When a fire department hires you, if you're already trained as a first responder inspector, you are the best choice amongst everybody else with the same qualifications, right? All things equal. And here's the deal. Everybody coming out of these programs will be trained to that, but they won't know it because no one's telling them. But I'm telling you. So as of January, when you leave this class, that's why you're getting all these certificates. I'm going to make sure that you meet the qualifications for first responder inspector and that your resume shows that. So we'll be doing that in class, and we'll get that done for you before you leave here. As you're finishing up your fire tech core classes, so many of you will be getting the fire tech core competency certificate in December. I want you to know that that makes you eligible for jobs in fire prevention. We'll look at those, okay? It does. And right now, since we're on the subject, the city of Orange is looking for fire prevention interns. And it doesn't matter if your career goal is suppression or prevention, they want to get you there. And they provide excellent, excellent training. They were recruiting the beginning of last spring, and now they're recruiting again because everybody they picked up then have gotten jobs. And I've been watching it happen in both suppression and prevention. And it's happening fast. Do the stuff I tell you to do, and it'll happen for you too. So this is the paradigm shift. More and more, right, our first responders are understanding that the risks they are being put at in the community are not acceptable. You really don't want to be exposed to those carcinogens. You really don't want to be exposed to those products of combustion for longer than you have to. And you want to be able to do your job quickly and effectively. And then everyone goes home. And that's what we want to. So good fire prevention takes a culture and it results in good fire operations. Might want to write that one down. Okay, here's a little quiz. I can't have you do a poll right now, so just raise your hand or put up a finger, 1, 2, or 3. Which is the most important service that we provide to the community? Is it EMS? Is it fire suppression? Is it fire prevention? Oh, don't say fire prevention. That's not going to make me feel better about you. Nobody would say fire prevention. Let's get real. And I'm not saying fire prevention should be above EMS or fire suppression. But what I would say is it shouldn't be lesser. It shouldn't be the one that gets cut if we have to make budget cuts. And then you'd be like, well, we shouldn't cut from there either, Suzanne. It's like, I know. We need to give the right amount of value to everything that we do for the community. And when we do it right, they stand up for us and they have our backs. Pay attention, you'll see, I'll tell you more. Okay, so how come fire prevention isn't embraced? Or is it? Yeah, now you're going to talk to a lot of people who will be like, yeah, I don't know anything about that. And you know what? They do. They know all kinds of stuff. They just don't know that they know it. The problem is we typically give you the fire code, a great big book, and it's written in a type 4 font. And we say, here, go apply this to that building. And nobody wants to do that. So the old guys, my peer group, used to say stuff like, oh, fire prevention is going to put us out of business. It won't. Literally, it will not, because we're not that good. We really aren't. We can't make all fires go away. It will never put you out of there. Literally is no building designed to have a fire and not have the fire department respond. Sprinklers. Nobody knows how to turn them off. And they're not even designed to put the fire all the way out. So, and hello, have you seen the wildfires? Just God's got your back. That's job security right there. The idea that it's not very challenging. Oh, I'm smarter than that. There's nothing to do. That's not true. It's incredibly challenging. And the highest level is fire protection engineering. Cal Poly San Luis Obispo has one of the premier programs in the country. Watch my video on what you can do with a fire technology degree. Okay. It's boring. Fire prevention is boring. Well, okay. We use big words. That part's true. And you can go, code is boring. And it is, unless you know about the dead people. Behind every code are a bunch of dead people and horrible stories. And you know what? Horrible stories are interesting. They are. You think so too, right? Seriously, nobody wants to watch a movie or anything about fire prevention. That's not fun to watch. We want to watch fire suppression. New Year's Eve, we watch a fake Yule log burn on TV without commercial interruption because we like fire. It's entertaining. What else? Oh, so it's not my job. That's that one you still hear. You hear that all the time, right? It's not my job. It is. And that's the paradigm shift from the culture change. And so when you go into that interview and they say, what does a firefighter do? What are you going to be doing for us? And you say, oh, fire suppression, community risk reduction, their jaw will drop. And then you'll talk to them about everything you know. And they'll hire you because nobody else knows that, right? And then you will go on and be a great leader, and children will want to grow up to be just like you, and women will want to date you and give you their phone numbers, and men will too. Everybody will. Or not. I don't know. So it's part of the job. But if you start thinking about it, not that hard. Okay, maybe it is. So fire prevention. So this is something I did want to talk to you about. So here's one of the cool things. Fire prevention is more economical than suppression. If it doesn't burn, we save it, right? And it costs us a lot to put fires out. So fire prevention is absolutely more economical. So Okay, that sounds really simple. Let me give you an example. Paradise, California, right? During the campfire, we lost Paradise. Now, this is a case study we're going to be looking at in this class. So the thing about Paradise is that everybody knew that they couldn't evacuate. There was no way to evacuate the community. And what they needed to do was build a bigger road. And they even knew how big the road should be. But it was going to cost something like $21 million. And nobody wanted to spend that. Now, PG&E should have given them the 21 million, because I think in the end it cost them like 35 billion. I could be way off on those numbers, so don't hold me to that. It was a lot. It was way, way more than the 21 million it would have cost to build the road to start with. But here, so right, and now when we look at what happened in Maui, there were things that could have been done, but they chose not to, like burying the electric wires. Burying electrical wires is one of the best things we can do to avoid wildfires, because the majority of them, turns out, are started by old electrical wires. And you're going to learn more about that. So they had a life expectancy of like 40 years, and now they're like 60 years old. So many communities bury the electric wires, but each community has to pay for it themselves. So rich communities can bury their wires and eliminate the hazard, but poor communities cannot. Now, why don't the politicians get involved? Because you cannot get reelected by preventing disasters. This is true. This is not my good idea. We've got all kinds of studies on this. And politicians who go and put out large amounts of money to prepare communities for disaster get voted out of office. Politicians who come up with money after a disaster has occurred for recovery, response and recovery, get reelected every time. So politicians aren't interested in preventing or mitigating the damage. But now they're starting to. And you know why? And by the way, this is the reason fire prevention is here to start with, because of the insurance companies. I know, it's true. So we'll talk about that next week when we go into the history. But insurance companies drive everything that we do. And in some states, it's the insurance commissioner who is in charge of fire prevention rather than a fire marshal. See, come to community college and learn shit. Okay, so people don't want to pay for fire prevention. People don't want to pay for earthquake mitigation. So when it comes to safety, right, not everybody wants to put their money where their mouth is. So it is more economical, but it is not more socially acceptable or politically acceptable. I guess we'll go with that. So what does this mean to you? This means it's important to build a coalition of people who agree with you. So just like the person, the firefighter who called me and said, Suzanne, here's an issue. His next thing was to start building a coalition of people who could help him. And of course, he started with his chief, because without his chief on this one, there was not going to be any place else for him to go. So it's got to start at the top of the organization. And if you're in an organization where it's not valued, then it's time to start changing the paradigm. The fire chief is the leader. Company officers lead by example. And I hope you keep that in mind when you do the reading assignment this week, that that is about how we influence other people and who influences other people, like you. So as a firefighter, a public servant, with a cool uniform and a nice reputation, people look up to you. Whether you're a firefighter or a company officer or a chief, the community looks up to you. And you have a voice that's louder and has more access than most people. The trade-off for that is if you screw up on the job, everybody's going to know about it because they'll put it in the paper, right? I know. So you are a local hero. Maybe you should go buy a cape for role play night, but understand that people are looking at you and you do lead by example. So here's a horrible story. How am I doing on time? Probably not great. So here's a horrible story. The very first open house I ever had to run, I obtained a great big tank of helium for balloons. And I got it donated by the local ambulance company. And so I brought it to the station. We had one station that we were opening. We hadn't had an open house in like 15 years. And everybody realized, we can't do that, Suzanne, because of liability. And I was like, no, we're going to do it. So I'd been with the department for like 3 months. So we do this. And they said, well, okay, but only at one station. And so I bring her this giant tank of helium. And the firefighters got very excited. And but the captain, company officer, went over and he started filling balloons. But he would fill a balloon and then he'd suck out all the helium and then start singing. I know. Well, it was funny when there weren't little kids there. But when little kids came in, it wasn't really funny. We had to tell them, sir, do not suck the gas in front of the children. Don't huff the helium when other people are watching. We lead by example. There's more to that story and it gets much funnier, but because this is being recorded, I can't tell it to you. Okay, so, but I do want you to remember, good fire prevention equals effective emergency operations. That's like going to be on a test. It's like peanut butter and chocolate. They go together great. Prevention, emergency operations go hand in hand. In fact, you know, the city of Phoenix, if you look at their after incident report or after action report, part of that includes having fire prevention come in and talk about the issues, whatever issues contributed to the incident. So now it's time for you to start taking notes on exactly how we help, right? Because you've just done this whole thing about, oh, if we do this, blah, blah, blah. So that was all nice. Change the paradigm, be a leader, embrace prevention, change the culture. And now this is how we actually help you on the fire ground. So we'll start off with supporting fire ground operations because obviously that's the title of the slide. So we're looking at construction document review. What does that mean? That means plan check. So and I was a plans examiner. So when I'm doing plan check before the building is ever built, I'm thinking about you. I'm thinking about where the hydrants are going to go. I'm looking at it for access. I'm looking at it for use. What are they going to be doing here? I'm looking at it for exposures to environmental concerns or to infrastructure, right? How close is it to the roadway? Are you going to be able to get in? What is the angle? You know, how steep is the driveway? Or all of the things that go in that could potentially be an issue. And this would include fire protection equipment that has to be installed as well. And we have the opportunity to put into buildings things like firefighter air replenishment systems. So you don't have to go all the way back down and out to refill your SCBA. So there's lots of different things that we take into effect. And probably one of the most important things that you should know under codes and ordinances is that the building code and the fire code are both designed to protect first responders. They're designed to keep people safe when the building's not on fire. They're designed to evacuate people or protect them when it is on fire. And it's also designed to protect the first responders when they come to deal with it. And we assume every building is going to catch on fire. So the last bullet point on this slide is probably the single most important one for you to write down, and that is building construction. That's it. You know, it's going to kill you. It won't be the extinguishers or the extension cords. It's the building. It's the building. And that's what we do. The building department, the architect, uses the codes to design a building that meets minimum standards. And that's it. It's just minimum. We help ensure that it meets those minimum standards when we occupy it. And then it's up to us to make sure it's maintained throughout the life of the structure. And we do it for you. Emergency operation access. You can't fight the fire if you can't get to it now, can you? The answer to that would be no. No, Freeman, we could not. So where are the hydrants located? Start paying attention to hydrant locations in your community. Some of them are located in places you should not be taking an engine into because there's no way back out. One of the things we don't ever want an engine to do during emergency operations is to have to back up. Certainly there will be times you have to, but we want to avoid that at all costs. So we're going to design access and egress for apparatus to be able to get in and out without having to back up. And it's not going to work everywhere, but wherever we can do it, we will. Roadway widths. This is a big deal. And again, whether we're looking in a rural area, and we'll see this when we look at the fires in Paradise, those roadways have to be kept clear and they have to be wide enough. So when we start talking about fire lanes and fire access roads, the intent is that if we have a truck that's working with aerial apparatus and the outriggers are deployed, all the other apparatus can get around around that truck and get past it. And that's important. That's an important feature to have. Fire protection systems. So certainly fire protection systems and equipment are important. What's really important is that you can depend that they will work. Start talking to firefighters. You're going to find there are some communities where they don't want to hook up to the standpipes because they don't think they're going to work. And we're going to look at situations in which people did depend on the systems to work and they failed. They have to be maintained. You don't just put them in and leave them there forever. And so they've got to be maintained. And so that's regulated. And that's part of our job, is to make sure that they're reliable. Now, here's a little story for you. Back in the 60s, we put these dry yard standpipes into these lots. And this was in Costa Mesa. And these lots were like 300 feet deep. And so this dry yard standpipe is a Siamese connection coming up. It's like pipe, right, that comes up with two hose connections on it. And then it goes underground and another Y comes up the other end of the property. What the engine does is it hooks into a hydrant, then it hooks into that dry standpipe right there, and it flows water through it. And then on the other end, you hook up your hoses and then you can run them. It's like having a hydrant, right? Well, they were put in, but they were never serviced. So they couldn't be depended upon. Our firefighters knew not to hook up to them. But when we started having mutual aid agreements, I know I'm really that old, and we started bringing in firefighters from Newport Beach or Huntington Beach, and they would respond to fires in this community, they'd be like, oh, look, a dry yard standpipe, and they'd hook up to it, and then it would blow up the front lawn, right? Because of the pressure from the hoses, because the piping was so corroded. And that takes time. In your textbook, in the back, in the appendix, there is a case law, and it is, I want to say it's C versus Seattle. but I could be wrong on that. It's somebody, or no, it's not even Seattle. I take it back. Steve versus Seattle was a different one. This is somebody versus Sacramento. So I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. But in this particular case, there was a standpipe that did not work. Fire department knew it didn't work. Building catches on fire. Fire department responds. They put the fire out. Nobody's injured. Nobody's killed. But they come back and they sue the fire department because the standpipes didn't work. And they never enforced anything to make them work. And the resident said, hey, if it had worked, we wouldn't have lost everything. It was thrown out, but then on appeal, it came back and the judge found the fire department to be liable for that. It's an interesting case study. Anyway, that's in the back of the textbook. So storage practices is another thing that we're going to look at and we're going to regulate. When we look at hazardous materials, the first principle of hazardous materials is to limit the quantities. And depending on how hazardous it is, will tell us how much we have to limit it. And then where is it being stored on the property and how is it being stored? Here's the basic principle. Something's going to go wrong. We want it to go wrong in the container. And if we can't limit it to the container, then we'll put it in a cabinet. And if the cabinet can't contain it, we'll put it in a closet. If we can't contain it to the closet, we're going to try to contain it to the room. And if we can't do that, maybe we're going to have to put it outside. So part of our job is to identify hazardous materials, and you're going to learn how to do that in this class. It's also being familiar with the technical support that is available. By limiting storage practices, we change the size of the fire. But as we come through here, you're going to see occupancies are designed for fire sizes. So when we talk about factories and we start classifying them, we're going to put them into two categories: moderate sized fire or a small, low fire. Anytime there's a chance, a high hazard, a chance for a hot, fast fire, all of those go into group H. So literally, every other occupancy designed for moderate or smaller sized fires. But it goes back to the storage practices. What's being stored and how is it being stored? Building construction and smoke management. So as we start looking at doing fire inspections and you start looking at engine company inspections, you're going to see the majority of people focus on things like extinguishers and extension cords. And that makes me crazy. The reason it makes me crazy is extinguishers and extension cords aren't going to kill you. The hole in the 4-hour wall will. So will the smoke. So we put barriers. We put barriers and we compartmentalize buildings to help you control fire. We'll put in systems to help you do that as well, to ventilate the building. And give you the opportunity to do your job well and effectively and safely, so everybody goes home. Technical support to the IC. We don't usually respond code 3 anywhere, but we do show up at fires and we do provide information to the incident commander. There's all kinds of information we can give them, stuff like floor plans, storage plans, information about changes to the occupancy or use of it, exposure information, information about what systems and equipment are installed, or, as I mentioned, what hazards, locations for egress or access. And so, and then after a fire, investigation quite often is also part of the duties in the Fire Prevention Bureau. So, and I almost forgot, code information about what they should be able to expect in that building. Okay, we're almost there, kids. Why? Why learn the historical impact of fire codes? Isn't it enough to just learn the code? And the answer is no, it's not. And here's why. Remember, I told you judges don't want to see us in there. Our job is to get voluntary compliance. If we can't, we're going to impose sanctions and we'll prosecute people. We'll do that. But that's the last thing we're going to do. And we're not going to do it that often. Well, it depends upon where you are. But our goal is voluntary compliance. The way we're going to do that is by creating partnerships with our stakeholders. So when we tell them that they have to fix something, we're going to tell them why. We're going to give them the rationale for it, and we're going to explain it to them using normal language, not the language of the code. So as we look at history, so we've got case studies. We've got case studies we are going to be looking at every week. And as you've seen, there's some books we are reading. We're starting with American Fire. This is going to take a look at culture and arson and community. And it follows a series of arson that occurred on the East Coast. I think it was around 2012, I want to say, about 10 years ago. I think you're going to find it, you'll find it interesting. It's super easy to read. And you have access to the book for free for 2 weeks. So if you can finish it in 2 weeks, you won't have to buy it. And I think it only takes something like 3 or 4 hours to read. Talk more about that. In any case, so the historical impact. So we're going to be learning the history of this. But here's the reason why we want to know this is because it helps us explain the code and to put it into context. It also helps us recognize hazards. So without knowing the code, if you know the stories and you recognize the same things and you can't find it in the code, you just call someone in prevention, text them and go, hey, Freeman, here's what I'm looking at. Where's it at in the code? And go, this is where that's at. Right? So you're somewhere, you know, the door has to open in the direction of travel, that it can't open in, or everybody's going to get stuck. But you don't know where it is. I'm going to tell you right now, it's in chapter 10, because I'm old, right? I know that stuff. So we can find it. All you have to do is recognize it. And the stories are good enough that if you listen to them, you learn it. I promise. So now, want me to read this to you? The historical perspective keeps from reoccurring tragedies. We can learn from our past mistakes. But we don't. That's the problem. We don't. We just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. In the Iroquois Theater fire at the turn of the century, I think that was 1901. Somebody went to the stage door and they went in and they yelled, is anybody still alive? And somebody yelled, yeah. No, nobody answered. Nobody said yes. Nobody was left alive. And the video you're going to watch about the station nightclub, you're going to see somebody run around to the stage door and they're going to yell inside, is there anybody still alive? And then you're going to hear nothing. One was in 1901-ish. The other was in 2023 or 2003. 100 years apart. And the same outcome. We don't learn, but we've got good stories to tell. Look at these. These are all stuff you'll see. They're all over the internet. Yes, you'll be looking at them a little bit deeper. I'll tell you stories, just heads up. All of mine end with dead people. Mine never end well. And this is why. And so it happens. And it happens again. And it happens again. And because, oh, why? So here's why. So this brings us we're getting there, kids. Uh, to the last part of this, which is what are the national, state, and local fire challenges, right? So what is it that our fire departments are dealing with, and what is it fire prevention can do to help them today? So we're going to take a look at how numbers have changed, and I think you're going to be surprised because the answer is pretty horrible. Our fire death rate has gone up. And maybe you're going to say, oh, was that the pandemic? So, right. So once again, we can look at this and it tells us, oh, code changes help protect the occupants, and they do. Sprinklers and exits and fire detection. We understand the tragedies, and so now we've prepared everybody, and it's wrong. Here's the problem. Today, the issues we have, the number one issue we have is climate change. Climate change, that's a big one. And here in California, followed by drought. And the reason it's a big deal is because it's political. In 2017, I was in a meeting in FEMA. And they were talking about how many billions of dollars had already been, this was dealing with emergency management, and they were talking about how many billions had already been spent on mitigating the issues from climate change, from the climate changing. But they couldn't say that because they had passed regulations that FEMA couldn't use the term climate change. They couldn't write it, they couldn't say it. And yet, we're spending billions of dollars on this, but nobody can talk about it. And our fires are changing and our communities are changing. That's a big deal. And it is our number one problem, one of our number one problems. Another issue that we have is terrorism. Yes, we are now under the Department of Homeland Security, and that occurred in mid-2000s. So what's the Department of Homeland Security interested in? Terrorism and protecting the borders. Fire is at the very bottom of that list, but this is where our funding comes from. The majority of terrorism that we are dealing with today coming from the inside, not the outside. Right? It's like, oh, the phone call, yeah, it's coming from inside, the babysitter one. Anyway, that's where it's at. And you are on the front line of all of it. If it is political unrest, you're there. If it is criminal justice issue and people start rioting, you're there. If it is a hazardous materials situation, you're there. And if it's a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake or a flood or a mudslide or a volcano eruption, you're there. And then we have the issue of homelessness. This is a problem all throughout the country. And what it comes back to is inadequate housing. And so as we start going through this class, you'll start seeing all of this stuff coming out and talking about how people have to learn how to cook well and how to heat their houses the right way. But the fire problem is much deeper than that. More often than not, it's tied back to the property owner, not the occupant. And the condition of the structure and its and whether or not it has services. Because if there is no heat coming into that building, people are going to find other ways to heat. So our national, state, and local fire challenges are very real. And in California, we've got our water issues on top of it. No matter what's going on in the country, fire is always a part of it. And those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with. Now, talk about the flip side of that and the challenges specific to you as a first responder, to us. Flame retardants. Right now, we do not have any fire suppressant agent that is not carcinogenic. Literally everything we use is harmful to both you and the environment. And so this puts you at risk. The more we start bringing science into what we do, the more we are able to learn the risks that are there and how to mitigate them. So what codes impact firefighter safety? Building codes. Let's just start with that. The building codes, the single most important thing to your safety, building codes. And here's a fun fact. So you'll hear me talk about our Polar Pathway program. So you can transfer to the University of Alaska Fairbanks and work as a paid firefighter while you finish your bachelor's or your master's degree. Or if you want to go to paramedic school. And they'll pay you like 30, I think it's 33 to 43,000 a year. It's really a great program. We've got all kinds of stuff going on this semester with that. But here's what I wanted to tell you. So this program is unique because the firefighters respond not just to the university, but also to the unincorporated areas of Fairbanks. The unincorporated areas of Fairbanks do not have a building code. This is true. There is no building code. They don't, and there's no hydrants. So you've got to bring tenders, you've got to bring your own water, and then, right, chances are you're going to surround and drown it. No one's going in to do a good interior attack. But they get good fires. The vice chancellor was talking to me and was telling me she had two 17-year-old kids who had come onto the campus and they were doing a ride along with the campus fire department. And they hadn't been there for more than 10 minutes or so when they got a call, the strip club was on fire. So they hopped into the rig and off they went, to put out the fire at the strip club, which they did. And when they came back, she said these kids had the biggest grins on their faces, and they came in going, when can we come to college? When do we get to start? In any case, my point here is stuff burns down. And without a building code, it's a given. Another story out of Fairbanks was a guy who was living in Fairbanks proper and was pissed off at the fire department because he didn't want to abide by the fire codes and building codes. So he took his building, everything's built on gravel there, and he moved it to the unincorporated area. And 6 months later, it burnt down. Because God has a sense of humor. Okay, so this brings us to the end, and you're going to be like, Suzanne, you said when we get to the end, we can stop. And it's like, you can, but you can't. Because now I want to take everything I just told you and show you how that applies. So when I tell you that fire prevention helps with fire department operations, I want to use this acronym to give you as an example. And I want you to use this because this is the cheat sheet to fire prevention, especially for you as a first responder. Because here's the deal. We love acronyms. This acronym is RECIO. RECIO was an acronym for the tactical priorities for fire suppression operations. So this is what they used in the old days before slicers and whatever it is they're using now. Rescue, exposure, confinement, extinguishment, and overhaul. So operations not using that anymore, but prevention is. I took it from them. It was public domain, so I stole it from them, and it works. Every firefighter I have ever talked to understands this. I was invited to speak for the NFPA and teach this at a conference in Mexico City. Keeping in mind, RECIO isn't spelled the same in Spanish, right? And my jokes don't go over quite the same way when they're being interpreted. But that's neither here nor there. I want you to remember this. So here it is: rescue, exposure, confinement, extinguishment, and overhaul. What does it mean? If we your first priority when you show up is a rescue priority, rescue anybody who's still in the building. Best case scenario, no one's in the building, right? We can do that. We can put in detection and alarm. We can put in notifications so the building calls you. We can make sure there's addresses there and there's fire department access to it. That there's addresses, there's numbers on the buildings, there's numbers on the rooms. You've got access to the elevators and the stairwells, the parking lots and the structure, the roof if necessary. And so we've got everything we need for everybody inside to be able to get out and for you to show up and go in, get them, and then get them out. And anything you can think of, whether it's an alarm system or sprinkler systems or fire extinguishers or the path of egress, confinement with barriers around it, or ventilate or a smoke management system, which would put people in, might be needed in order to protect people for the rescue, in order to get them out of the building. One of our case studies is, oh, never mind, that's 106, but the MGM Grand. In the MGM Grand, people went to evacuate, they got into the stairwell, doors closed behind them, and then they had 20 floors, and they couldn't leave the stairwell, and smoke got into the stairwell. And they couldn't make it to the first floor, and they couldn't make it back to the 20th floor. So they laid down and died. Maybe they fell down. I think they probably laid down because it was smoke. Anyway, so rescue. And if you come in and go, hey, Freeman, you know what? I was just in this building, and here's why I don't think we'd be able to achieve the rescue priority. Either we're going to get stuck, or the occupants will get stuck. And if you tell me why, I can find you a code that'll help fix it. Exposures. These can be interior, these could be exterior. Typically, we think of them as exterior. This could be environmental, or maybe it's an exposure to a population. Maybe we're inside a building and we're looking at the exposure from the warehouse to the office, or a building to a canyon, or a canyon to a neighborhood. Or one pile of stored goods being exposed to another stored pile of flammable liquids or hazardous materials or incompatible materials. So what are we going to do with that? We're going to separate stuff out. We're going to separate it out. We're going to create barriers. We're going to protect the exposures. And if you say we've got an issue with exposure protection, like that community I was telling you about, to the wildland interface, we can find codes to deal with it. Next thing is confinement, the ability to hold fire to one spot. Remember I told you with storage, we're going to try to hold it to the container, or the cabinet, or the closet, or the room. And if we can't do that, we'll do it to the floor of the building or to the building. And if we can't do that, we'll do it to the block or the neighborhood. And if at any time you come and you say, okay, here's why we can't, well, then we can find fire code. We can use the code and our regulations to find ways in which we can. And then we get to extinguishment. And here's what you need to know. This always involves you. You need access, you need water supply, you need extinguishing agents, you need to know where things are at in order to be able to do your job right, and you need enough. And so when we look in Maui, where they go in, they try to open up a hydrant and nothing comes out. And that's happened here too. That's why we work together to make sure that when you need it, it's going to be there for you. And now we get into overhaul. When we get to overhaul, you know, that's salvage and ventilation, you'd be like, come on, Sam, what does that have to do with prevention? Well, hopefully you're salvaging stuff that was saved because prevention worked, right? And there wasn't as much property loss. But here's the thing. This is during overhaul operations, yeah, you're doing salvage and ventilation, but the other thing you're doing is really what is true fire prevention work. You're separating ignition sources from fuel sources. You're trying to avoid a rekindle, or as some fire departments like to call them, second fires. And this is what happened on Maui. The firefighters went out, right? Electric lines came down, fire started. I don't know if both of those happened together, but sounds like that is what happened. Firefighters came out to put the fire out, and then they were redeployed to another area where they were needed. And the community says they didn't put it out all the way. The winds came up, it came back up, and then it got out of control. So here's the thing. When we talk about fire prevention, all fire prevention is preventing ignition. Once the fire starts, we failed. This is why most departments have changed their names. So we're no longer fire prevention, we're now risk reduction or community risk reduction. Because most of what we do is mitigate. We can't prevent all fires. So we're going to try to make sure that when one starts, we're going to try to design an environment to keep it in an incipient phase for 10 minutes. It's a worthwhile goal. It's not easy to do, but it's a worthwhile goal because then you'll show up. That's about enough time to show up and be able to come in, do your thing, put the wet stuff on the red stuff, put everything out, sing kumbaya, and everyone goes home. So here's the deal. There's only 3 ways to prevent fire ignition. I know you paid $46 a unit for this class, and it turns out there's only 3 ways to prevent a fire. We have 16 ways. Here they are. You have, by the way, this also works if you are bringing your teenage daughter and her boyfriend on vacation with you, which I don't suggest you do, unless you are the teenage daughter or the teenage boyfriend or whatever. Okay, so here's the thing. What works for fire prevention also works for conception, birth control. So see, because you're learning for a living, not just a grade. So here you go. 3 things: birth control and fire prevention. Time, distance, and barriers. That's how we prevent the spread of fire and babies. Time, distance, barrier. When we have welding going on, the fire code requires fire watch for 30 minutes following that. That's time. And you know, if you've been to the beach, you don't go walking in a fire pit if you know that it's been used. Time. Distance. So we have all kinds of requirements for distance. We've got requirements for you have to be 50 feet away from flammable liquids if you're going to be smoking. If we're going to store flammable liquids near a tent, they have to be 100 feet away. So distance. In a commercial, and then the other thing is barriers. So in a commercial restaurant where we have a deep fat fryer and we have a range with open flames on it, the code requires that fryer be separated from the range by a minimum of 18 inches distance. And so to accomplish that, we can put in like a little spacer, like a table or countertop or something like that, right, to get that 18 inches. But if the kitchen's not big enough to get that 18 inches horizontally, it's back and forth. You need to know that. Then we can do it vertically, up and down. We can do it vertically. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to take like sheet metal, a piece of sheet metal that comes up that 18 inches and it's wide enough that it covers the appliance. And we'll use that. And that's a barrier. In the buildings, in our buildings are firewalls. The majority of the firewalls, we don't call them firewalls. There's a special kind of wall we'll call a firewall. The other ones that are rated, we call those fire barriers. So 3 ways to prevent ignition, fire prevention, 3 ways to prevent ignition and babies: time, distance, barriers. And that's what we are going to do in order to achieve protection. Okay, so let's put this into one last story so you can see how this all plays out. So I want you to imagine you're on this fire engine, okay? This is a strip mall located on the city lines between Fountain Valley and Huntington Beach. Okay, and you can look at this. It is not a very fancy strip mall. There's no big anchor store or anything like that. These are little itty bitty, what we would call group M, group B occupancies, with some exceptions. Business, mercantile, for the most part. So you see, we've got nightclubs, we've got futons, we've got a jewelry store, we've got sporting goods, video games, a pet store, a dentist, used bookstore. Have you ever smelled a used bookstore? If you know, you know. Okay, a pawn shop. There's a little place that sells spas, and they have a working one inside. And a fish and chip place. That's it. Behind it is a residential area. And to the left, to your left, is also high density residential, and to the right is going to be more commercial. So I've got Recio up there, and I want you to look at these, and I want you to imagine, you have rescue issues in any of these places? What are your exposure issues? Confinement going to be an issue? Extinguishment? And in terms of prevention, where are we going to find ignition sources and fuel supplies that'll be of a concern? You see anything in here that would be an issue? If you do, write it down. Now, the next question I have, feel free to write this down. What questions, if you're in that rig and you wanted to answer my Recio questions, what else do you want to know about these buildings or these occupancies, these uses, or the site? Here are some things I would be thinking about. Where's my nearest hydrant? Not on site. How much separation is there between the building and the residential area? And I'm going to tell you there's an alley back there. What I really want to know is there separation between any of these units, or is there one common attic? Because if there's one common attic and a fire gets into it, then it's going to involve everything. If there's separation, only part of the building is going to be involved. So we'll only have a few units to have to worry about. Is there separation, or is it all one? So here's the thing. I was asked to do training for Central Net. This is Huntington Beach and Costa Mesa, Newport Beach and Fountain Valley. And so that's why I picked this, right? Because Fountain Valley, Huntington Beach. And so I put this out. Firefighters knew this location. And just so you know, this is not the current occupants. But it was super interesting when I did it. So that's why I'm giving it back to you. So so they were familiar with this place. And so that was my question to them. Where's the nearest hydrant and what type of separation do you have? Nobody knew. Now, I taught the class like 10 times. So by the time I got to the fifth class, then people knew, right? They went out. It's like, someone's going to ask you that. In any case, right? So that's what I would want to know, because the worst case scenario is if it's all involved. This is why you need to understand fire behavior. And we've got colleges where fire behavior is like the last thing you learn. Here, it's got to be one of the first, because we want to teach you how to use this. So watch. Oh, never mind. But I had this all set up to like slide in and do stuff, and that didn't work. Dang it. And I'm not gonna refilm this. So just deal with me the way it is. And in fact, oh no, I can leave it there like that. Okay, let's start off with fish and chips. So fish and chips, you're like, well, that's not a big deal, Suzanne, except it is because of the grease. They got grease. And that grease gets into the hood system, right? We put a grease extraction system, a hood's what we call a hood system over that. It's going to extract the grease, but if they don't clean it, it has to be cleaned as often as necessary, or at least once every 6 months. That's where the fire is going to be, and that'll go right into the attic. Over on the left, we've got a nightclub. This nightclub was a very special nightclub. That was where people over 30 went to find their second spouse. They had open flame, they did cooking, and of course, they served alcohol. So this is only an issue at night. We've been to a lot of nightclub fires. So this would be the life safety occupancy you would be concerned about. If you look, you'll see that there is a tank of compressed gas there, and there's one over here at the fish and chips place. Why? Because we would expect to find compressed gases in both of these places, whether it be helium for balloons or CO2 for the soda machine. We would expect to find compressed gases. Now you're going to go, those are not flammable. And I'll say, you're right, but they're compressed. So those tanks are going to levy and hit you in the ass if they're not secured. And that's one of our jobs, is to make sure that they're secured, so that if they do levy, they'll just stay in one place and not go shooting off and hit you. You're welcome. Okay, over here was the futon, right? What's wrong with futons? Nothing. So futons are lovely until they catch on fire, because they're made out of foam. And when we get to the station nightclub, we are going to see issues with foam. Just know it burns good and drippy. So fire, lot of heat. Over here, what was that? This was the spa. That was the spa. What's the issue there are the chemicals, the pool chemicals. So they've got a working spa in there. So they're going to have acid and chlorine, and they're also selling some of that in there. Well, no, they're not selling it, but they have it for maintenance purposes. And so we're going to find that in there. Now, I know the next ones look a little bit weird, right? So what was this? This was a pawn shop. And here's what I want you to know about a pawn shop. Pawn shops have guns. And sometimes they're in Iraq, just like in that, not Iraq, but Iraq, like you see there. And they're not supposed to be loaded. But you know what? Sometimes they are. And we learned that when we had a fire in one of these little strip malls, and the pawn shop caught on fire, and the firefighters who were ventilating on the roof were getting shot at from below. Now, what else do you have in a pawn shop? Jewelry. Well, that doesn't burn, Suzanne. No, it doesn't. But do you know that they use cyanide to clean it? So they've got cyanide in there, and they also use compressed gases like argon or nitrogen to clean the jewelry with as well. So we've got more compressed gases, and now we've got arsenic. And remember, there was a jewelry store on the other side. So you see the same stuff over there. They just don't have the guns. Well, maybe the cashier does, but not like on display, right? Okay, so then we go back over and we have our bookstore, and there, like the futon, there's your class A fuels, right? That's going right to the ceiling. And you guys know that, right? Foam is class A. Even if it gets drippy, it's still class A. You knew that. Then we have a dentist. She looks like a nice dentist. She has compressed gases too, right? starter, goodbye, and oxygen and stuff. More compressed gases. Then over here, we've got video games, plastics. And then over here, this is sporting goods. That's Turner Sporting Goods. They sell ammunition, they sell guns, they sell camping fuel, they sell flannel and sleeping bags. It's a pretty good fuel supply. You got one of everything over there. Probably even have some magnesium, not in like large quantities, but you got a lot of stuff in there. And then we have the pet store. But here's the deal. It's not just any pet store. This is prehistoric pets. They only have reptiles. Anything they have with fur leaves in a paper bag because it's food. An inspector I know went in there to do an inspection, wandered into the cricket room and said her uniform just filled with crickets. That's like, I'm laughing. That would be a horrible experience. Today, they're also known as the Reptile Zoo, and they charge admission, making them an assembly use. They have birthday parties there too. And the interior finish, all kinds of straw and stuff to make it look tiki-like. The cool thing about them is they have a bigger breeding program than the San Diego Zoo. But you know what these animals cannot do? Generate their own heat. So the electrical in here is crazy. Not only that, they have animals in here that are not for sale. They have a snake that's over 25 feet long. They got prehistoric fish and turtles and huge, like reptiles. Not the kind you keep at home in like a jar. So I was talking to a firefighter who said, well, he was doing an inspection, right? This is why fire prevention is not boring. So he was there and they were cleaning out one of the lizard's tanks or living whatever cage. And so the lizard was out in the back. And remember I told you that this opens to an alley? Well, somebody left the door open or something and the lizard got out. And he gets into the alley and he stands up on his hind legs and he spreads his, like, I don't know, head flippers or whatever they are. No, he gets his little arms and he just starts trucking, he just starts running down the alley. And like I said, he just took off. And these two kids who were working said they were probably on the football team. They went out into the alley and they took off on a dead run and threw a flying tackle and brought that lizard to the ground. And they hauled it back. How cool is that? It's interesting, right? That is interesting. That's not boring. That's interesting. But now, remember I told you, so, okay, where's the water supply? Is there separation in here or not? Because now let's put all of this together. Now that we know the hazards, if this catches on fire and there is a common attic, and this is at night, we've got drunk, middle-aged people trying to get out, getting in your way. We don't have any other people we have to worry about, but we've got ammunition going off on both sides. We've got compressed gas cylinders that are bleving and going off on both sides. We've got nitrogen being, or not nitrogen, cyanide being released into the air. And if you go through the roof, if you fall through the roof, you're going to find your ass in the middle of a snake pit. And that's why pre-planning is so important. So you're going to learn pre-planning and doing pre-incident inspections are very much alike, but significantly different. Here's how. When you go in and you do a pre-plan, this is where you go in and you look at all of those hazards and you go, here's what we have. This is what they're storing. This is where it's at. We got a ton of electrical, blah, 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 blah. You can't change anything. You just have to accept it the way it is. when we do an inspection and we find something that's a problem, this electrical looks crazy, then we get to fix it. And when you do a pre-plan and you go, oh my gosh, look at what they're storing here, look at what they're doing here, or this is why this is going to be an issue, then we can go out and take care of that. And when you know stories like this, then you know that when you go in to do that inspection and you're in the pawn shop, have them open up the guns and show you that they're not loaded. It's not on the inspection check sheet. Our job is to create a work environment for you that is as safe as it possibly can be. And sometimes not everything is on the list. And that's why understanding history and fire behavior and building construction and fire codes and regulations is so important. And this is where the magic meets, or the regulations meet. This is where we meet, of firefighting and fire prevention. Together, we make the community safe. And we get paid pretty well for it too. So there's that. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Uh-oh, where'd the summary go? Oh, well, I don't know where the summary went, but here's the summary for you. There's a paradigm change that needs to come about, and that is putting prevention up there with the same level of importance and resources as both EMS and suppression. Together, we make fireground operations more efficient, safer, and better for everybody. Some of the ways we do that is by regulating storage, which is the fuel load, systems and equipment, which will help you manage fire growth and fire spread, ensuring egress and access is available for both the people in the building and for you, the first responder. They also help with providing technical information to the incident commander. We said learning history was important because we can put context to the code, but it also helps us recognize it and explain it. And then finally, we looked at what some of today's fire problems are and the issues and challenges that we're facing. And from climate change to drought to terrorism and homelessness. These are the issues we're dealing with today. And I almost forgot, cancers and everything else that come along with our flame retardants and our fire suppressant agents. Yeah. Even the extinguishers. Anyway, so those are all issues that we are dealing with, and our changing communities are part of that. So this is all stuff that we will be looking at some more. So now, to follow this up, there's a video for you to watch, and it is about the science of firefighting and your role in being a leader and being able to collaborate and become an advocate for safety, for safer operations and safer policies for both firefighters and our community. So with that, Professor Freeman saying thank you. If you're still listening, thank you for that. And I'll see you next week.